If you are worried you have Lyme disease, or just like the outdoors, and want the peace of mind of knowing whether you have Lyme disease or not, there is a new Lyme screening test based on decades of research by Dr. Richard Marconi, a professor at VCU Medical Center. For more information, visit glymedx.com, that's glymedx.com, or email at info@glymedx.com.
Infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
My interview today was actually triggered by an article that I saw in the past week or two called "Animal Lovers Should Support Animal Research, Not Condemn It," and here's why. And the author says, scientists are at the cusp of discovering treatments that could help pets with cancer at a much lower cost if we let them continue with animal medical research needed to make these discoveries. But all over the country, self-professed animal lovers are lobbying for limits on, or even an end to, medical research involving animals. And he continues saying that's counterproductive because animals are among the primary beneficiaries of such research. Tens of millions of animals are used for scientific and commercial testing in the U.S. that benefits humans and animals alike. Despite this obvious benefits, animal research draws a lot of criticism in some circles, and the most common argument revolves around the case that it's cruel and inhumane. Well, joining me now to look at what's behind the scenes with animal research and some of the arguments, pro and con, is Cindy Buckmaster, Ph.D. Dr. Buckmaster is the director for the Center for Comparative Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Buckmaster, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much, too. Now, let's start out with what types of animals are used in animal research in North America?
Well, so most of the animals that are a part of biomedical inquiry are rodents, mainly mice. I would say that over 95% of the animals that are in studies are mice. And a much, much smaller percentage of animals then are something other than mice. Another very big model for study right now is zebrafish, and so they're starting to make a big splash, no pun intended. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the animals can vary. I mean, so people ask this question all the time, and the question really should be, what is the best model? What is the best animal to model a particular question with respect to a given disease? And that's really what it comes down to. And so the reason that mice are so popular is that when you are looking at a biological process and you're trying to understand it, and by the way, this is a really necessary part of research, right? This sort of basic research. You can't understand why something isn't working if you don't know how it functions when it is working properly, right? And so the beginning point in studying and understanding any kind of biological process and then a disease that infects it is understanding what these systems and how they work, what they look like and how they work and how they function when they're healthy, right? And so mice are really a strong common model because you can look at a lot of different aspects of disease, right? So people don't really always get this, but diseases are complex and biology is complex, and there's a molecular level of understanding that has to be obtained, and there's a cellular level of understanding that has to be obtained, and there's knowledge and understanding that has to be gained from looking at tissues and organ systems and all the way up to sort of the organism level. And all of these interactions among all of these systems are part of the phenomenon of biology. And they're also part of the phenomenon of health. And then they are also a part of the phenomenon of disease. And so trying to understand what's going on when there's a disease requires a thorough knowledge of all of these various levels, including the genetic level of disease and of health, right? And so mice are very strong models for disease because we can look at the molecular underpinnings of health and disease. We can look at the genetic underpinnings of health and disease. They're very common in cancer studies because we can look at this level of cancer, right? These levels, these molecular questions can be asked. These genetic questions can be asked. And then for different questions then usually involve different animals. And the point again is that in order for a protocol for study to be approved by the oversight bodies, and anyone who does research with an animal has to have an institutional animal care and use committee that oversees all of this work. And when they write these protocols, they have to explain and prove why it is that the animal they're choosing for the system they're evaluating, which addresses some aspect of a disease that they're interested in studying, why that animal is not just good, but why that animal is A, necessary, and then B, optimal. And that's when animals will get approved for a particular study. So people just can't grab up any animal and study, whatever they want. There has to be some real rationale for that, and that rationale is based on what we already understand about animal systems and biology from decades and decades of work. And so there could be any kind of lots of rodents, mice, rats, rabbits, sometimes dogs, sometimes cats, sometimes monkeys. I mean, those three animals are used in very, very, very small numbers relative to the others. Zebrafish I mentioned to you already, but chinchillas, different birds, pigeons, sometimes sheep, cattle sometimes. I mean, just about any kind of animal you can think of has probably been a part of science and biology and biomedical research at some point, depending on the question of interest.
Right. Now, the testing and research on animals benefits humanity in major ways, biomedically and commercially and healthcare. Dr. Buckmaster, can you discuss some of the big benefits that most of the listeners might recognize from animal research?
I can do that, but first I want to distinguish between two of the terms you used.
Sure.
You used research and you used testing, and they're not the same. So research, when someone says research, or when I think of research, I mean basic research, and this is this study of natural systems, when they're healthy, and understanding how things, how disease develops, and then understanding the mechanism for how that disease develops so that you can then engineer a potential solution or treatment. That's research. Testing is different, and this is, I think, what most people in the public think about when they think about animals and research. They sort of conflate the basic research part with the testing part, because as human beings, we only think about what happens, sort of right in front of us. So most people, when they think about animal testing, are thinking about what's happening before drugs are released, and that's true. But there were decades of basic research that informed the development of that compound that is now going to be tested to determine whether or not it's going to be safe for human clinical trials. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yes, and so the basic research that goes on for decades, and that knowledge is drawn from probably thousands of people who are looking at various aspects of the system involved in this particular disease in question. That's collected, and then ultimately somebody has enough information, or groups have enough information to devise a treatment strategy. And once that treatment strategy comes to light, that's when we move into the testing phase to see whether or not the compounds will be safe and effective. And then at that point, if it's determined in animal work that's the case, then that compound would move on to clinical trials with people. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, when you ask me, to explain to the listeners, or describe to the listeners what kinds of treatments are available to them as a consequence of all of this work, I mean, I would say it's impossible for me to think of one that isn't, right? So vaccines, all of the over-the-counter meds that they take, anti-inflammatories, any kind of pain medication, all the diagnostics that they've grown accustomed to, right? So MRIs and all of these things that allow us now to look at the inside of the body without having to be cut open like in the old days, all of the surgical procedures that are available to them, and the different kinds of surgical procedures, the improvements that have come from that, right? Like the laparoscopic procedures that have been modified and improved to allow for a better impact, a better effect, and certainly quicker healing. Total hip replacements. I mean, you name it.
Yeah, it goes on and on.
Everything you can think of, any kind of, I mean, AIDS, you think of all the people who are living with AIDS. When I was a kid, back in the 80s, it was killing everybody, and now nobody dies from AIDS, really.
Sure.
They from HIV. I mean, they're just living with this disease, and they have all of these treatments that allow them to do that. Diabetes is another one. People used to die from diabetes. This is not something we think about now, unless people don't care for themselves, right? Every disease or every medication you can think of, every vaccination you can think of, every surgical procedure, technique and technology that you can think of, every imaging technology that you can think of, all of these things were the direct result and consequence of biomedical research with animals. Right.
Now, you've been working in animal research for some time. What do you say to critics that say that hopefully I'm mixing the words up again. Animal testing is cruel and inhumane, and do they make a case?
Right. So, you sort of are mixing the words, but it doesn't matter. What they really mean is, animals in some aspect of research, they believe it's cruel and inhumane. And the answer is that they are getting all of this information from the animal rights movement, extremists who have their own motivation, and that is, and it doesn't have anything to do with caring for animals. It has to do with profit and controlling public opinion. And they're giving them very manipulated messages intentionally so that they can accomplish their agenda. And their agenda is to end all research with animals. Before it's responsible for us to do this and before viable alternatives are available for us to use in place of that work, right? And so the public says this, and they don't really even know what they're talking about because the people who are telling them also don't know what they're talking about. They make very sweeping allegations about things that they either completely fabricate or things that they have found, because of the exception to the rule, right? Some person who either made a mistake or was really not doing what they were supposed to do, and then they take the example of this rare individual and turn it into a broad stroke against all of animals in research. And the fact of the matter is that it's not true. I'm not saying that there aren't instances where people do something they're not supposed to do, right? This is the same as when you hear about the person who goes for a procedure on their left leg and wakes up and the procedure was on their right leg. Right? Things like this happen. But there are a lot of regulations and a lot of layers of oversight, and a lot of training and a lot of monitoring and a lot of professional involvement. We have folks who are professionally certified in husbandry, vet tech care. We have specially boarded veterinarians. We have specially trained animal behaviorists. We have specially trained folks who are involved in animal environmental enrichment for these animals, because it's not just their physical well-being that we have to maintain. It's also their mental stimulation, their behavioral well-being. So there are a lot of people here to ensure that these animals are getting absolutely everything they need, because if we don't have a very happy, healthy animal, then none of the information that comes from these animals will be of any value when it comes down to crunching the numbers and looking at the data and how that will translate into tomorrow's treatments and cures, right? So there's a really strong investment for folks to make sure that these animals have every single one of their needs accounted for. So I would say that that's a very grossly misinformed perspective based on intentional misinformation from a group of folks who have an ulterior motive and an alternative agenda.
Yeah, and you alluded to how a lot of the public has been swayed against animal research, and the author of the article I talked about in the intro is Matthew Bailey with the Foundation for Biomedical Research. You probably know him.
Sure.
Yeah, he writes that despite all the scientific progress, after he listed a whole bunch of things, and the many animals that have benefited from it, nearly half of all Americans oppose research in animals, according to a recent Gallup survey. Almost 6 in 10 voters want to cut federal funding for testing on dogs and cats. So they clearly have a loud mouthpiece because they're getting through.
Well, there's no mystery about why this is.
Yeah.
The reason this is happening is because the research community has failed abysmally at educating the public about anything they're doing for decades. Right? So because the research community has not been talking about sharing the truth about any of this, and several of us are starting to do this now. I'm the chair of Americans for Medical Progress, and we collaborate with groups like Matt's group, and also I'm on another board with the National Animal Interest Alliance, another really fantastic group that is concerned with animal welfare across all animal interests, not just research. I'm the president of the Texas Society for Biomedical Research, and these are all advocacy groups. And really, when I say advocacy, what I really mean is education. I'm a past president of the American Association for Lab Animal Science, and they have an advocacy outreach arm called the ALAS Foundation. These are all groups who are now putting out a lot of information to educate the public, right? And the problem is it sort of comes sort of late, right? It's come late, and folks have already been brainwashed, and now the research community has already been demonized, and so now whatever they see, they sort of question as it's not true, and it is true, right? So and now, I mean, one of the great things, and I know you're going to hopefully put this hyperlink up on your post, but with Americans for Medical Progress, AMP, we've released a really nice video, and you'll see the video there. And this was actually taken in a research institution, so all the animals you see are in their institution, living exactly the way they live in a research institution. There is no question about it. It's a fact, right? If you go to the Come See Our World site, which I also gave you a hyperlink to, you'll see more of the same. Hundreds of images of animals, research animals, in research institutions from all over this country. This is exactly how they live, and you'll see the truth with your own eyes. And what's really interesting about this is that some of the animal rights people have come back and said, oh, well, this is completely fabricated, right? And I say, okay, well, prove it. They can't prove it, right? I mean, the truth is on our side. The truth is the truth. And they're not quite sure what to do with this level of transparency that they've been demanding all this time. And they didn't get what they were asking for, and research communities have been clammed up for a long time because, 10, 15 years ago, research institutions were getting, and researchers were getting terrorized by some of these really extreme groups, and they became quite fearful of even saying they had animals in research. And so that sort of became the model, and institutions have just sort of clammed up. The consequence of that, however, is that then the public didn't get the information they needed. And so it's not their fault that they have been swayed. They had nothing else besides what they were hearing to compare with, right? There was no other information, right? They heard all of this crazy stuff from the animal rights people, and that was it. We, the research community, created this informational void and then stepped aside and let fanatics fill it with fiction, and that's where we are now. So we're at the point now where we're trying to educate them and show them, come see our world. Show them we have started doing, AMP anyway, has started doing some lab tours, and other institutions are opening up their institutions, allowing folks to come in and tour, whether they're media folks or school kids. I myself have done, and I don't know if you saw it, but we had the Nickelodeon folks, Nick News at Night, I guess. Nick News is a kids' TV program, so we had them come in actually and film our animals and interview us, right? So they came through several of our facilities and put that right on TV, right? And so this was a great opportunity to show people the truth. It breaks my heart. I mean, it makes me feel, so as someone who adores animals myself, I understand why these people are upset. And honestly, before I knew the truth, I felt the same way. I mean, if you send me a piece of literature and you say all of these awful things are happening, and then you send me some horrible picture that in most cases was probably doctored, but I didn't know that, right? I mean, I wrote checks to all of these people because it looks so awful. And what's killing me now is I know the truth. I live with the truth. And I speak out about the truth, and I feel horrible for these people whose hearts and wallets have been manipulated, but mostly their hearts, right? Their hearts have been manipulated and twisted, and these people are walking around with this burden, really believing that animals are treated this awful way, and they're not, and they should be relieved of that burden. It's I'll tell you what's cruel and inhumane is. Hey,
Cindy, can I stop you for a second? I'm up against a hard break.
Yes, okay.
And we'll come back, and after the break, we'll have more with Dr. Cindy Buckmaster. We're back with Dr. Cindy Buckmaster, and we're talking animal research. And Dr. Buckmaster, go ahead and continue on your point, please.
Yes, I'm sorry. You had mentioned that folks that aren't, the support for research is 50-50 according to Matt's article, and that's true, and that the reason for that is that they are all convinced that this work is cruel and inhumane. And I think I explained to you earlier that we have all of these professionals who really love these animals and have special training to care for them. But I'll tell you what's cruel and inhumane. We were talking about the extremists misinforming all of these people, and what's cruel and inhumane is manipulating people's hearts and making them carry this burden, which is based on false information, so that you can get their money to accomplish an agenda that is actually going to harm the people you're manipulating and their pets. That's what's cruel and inhumane.
All right. Now, let's talk about what are the regulations, what are the protections that are in place for these animals? Right.
So there are several. There's anybody who gets grant money from the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest granting agency in the country, maybe the world. They're all regulated by the Public Health Service policy on the main use of laboratory animals by an office at the NIH called the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. So, and that includes everything, mice and all of the animals, anything that's alive and is a vertebrate, including fish, for that matter. In addition, animals, every other animal that's not a purpose-bred mouse, rat, or bird is also protected and covered by a federal law, the Animal Welfare Act, and that's monitored and overseen by the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service section of the USDA. So there's a lot of regulation. In addition to that, and so, by the way, the USDA comes annually unannounced and evaluates your entire program, and you don't know when they're coming, fine. And then in addition to that, you have, I mentioned this earlier, an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and this is your in-house oversight group, and this group is responsible for overseeing the entire animal program. And it includes researchers, it includes veterinarians, and other subject matter experts. But I think the most important part of that committee, as far as the public and public trust, is it also includes a community member. So there has to be somebody from the general community who's not involved in the research and doesn't work in the institution, who is just there to represent public interest. And that person reviews the protocols with everybody else and does the facility inspections with everybody else and has equal opportunity and power to vote and question whatever comes up. So this is an important thing. Now, that body will go through the facilities twice a year and also evaluate the entire program twice a year. And in addition to that, then, you have multiple levels of leadership. And so I had sort of touched on this earlier, but most people don't understand that the animals in research don't actually usually live with the researchers, and their day-to-day care is not provided by the researchers. Their day-to-day care is provided by laboratory animal science professionals. And this is an entire field that, and these are the careers I was mentioning earlier, where you have specially trained managers, specially certified, specially trained husbandry and certified, specially trained and certified husbandry people, specially trained and certified vet techs, specially boarded veterinarians. Our veterinarians are like the Marines of the veterinary world. They know, they have to know about every kind of animal you can think of and every kind of system. And they're specially boarded. And then we have specially trained and certified behaviorists and so on and so forth. And so all of those people are monitoring the animals as well. We have to be with our animals 7 days a week, obviously, and so they get a huge amount of oversight. And so there are different levels of oversight built within that structure as well, right? You have middle supervisors, higher level supervisors, managers, operations managers, and people above that, right? So there are all kinds of checkpoints to ensure that all of the animals have everything they need, and that includes addressing all of their behavioral needs. So there is a lot of regulation and a lot of oversight. Now, on top of that, and this is, I think, probably the thing, my favorite part of when it comes to not necessarily oversight, but ensuring that your program is as good as it can be and that your animals are getting the best care possible. There's an organization, they're now called just ALAC International, but that was initially an acronym that stood for the Association of Assessment and Accreditation for Laboratory Animal Care International. And this is a group of peers, right? So this is a peer review. that institutions volunteer for so that we can be accredited. And it's very powerful. I mean, here we have, we'll get 5 people for 4 days or 4 people for 5 days, one or the other, and they go through every single detail of your program, how you train your people, how you document things, your environmental enrichment program, your protocol review. I mean, they go through absolutely everything. And, of course, these people are experts because they are among our peers and do this for a living. And so that is the most powerful, I think, evaluation of our animal programs and the most powerful testament to how well our animals are cared for. And this group celebrated its 50th anniversary, I guess, a year or two ago. So they've been around quite a while. And the whole mission of this organization is to ensure that you're always raising the bar for how your animals are cared for, right? So and we have a great program. When we get, fantastic reviews, it doesn't matter. The next time they come around, they're going to look for other ways that we can make things even better, right? So we far exceed whatever is required by regulation, but ALAC isn't about meeting the minimum. It's about, all right, well, what else can you do to make it even better? And the really great thing is that they travel all over the world, and they can share ideas, cool things that they've seen other places, and they share that with everybody else. And it's really the research community's passion, right? It's our passion to get our arms around this and do everything we possibly can. Because the bottom line is we really love these animals. The people who care for these animals love them. These are animal lovers, right? And so this is really important to us because we love the animals and because we love the people and animals who will benefit from this work, but primarily because we love the animals we work with.
Now, Dr. Buckmaster, are there really, it's 2017, right? And are there really truly viable alternatives that would spare the use of animals, as some critics will say?
Yeah, so if that were true, that would be happening. Animal work is even if you don't care about animals, animal work is ridiculously expensive. And so if there were other ways to answer these questions and they were available and the regulatory agencies had validated them, we'd be doing it, believe me. And I hope we continue to get to that place. I mean, I can tell you that there's a lot of work now. People are working, and they have it all along. I mean, the research community has been working on the development of non-animal of alternative ways to answer some of these questions without animals. And the truth also is that nearly every sort of study that you can think of involves a combination of non-animal technologies in addition to work with animals. So these are already being used, right? But the question is, well, how can we take the information we know now and move into some other really clever ways to get more predictive answers and also remove animals from research, or at least reduce them as much as possible. And the stem cell-based technologies are moving in that direction. And I think that, we'll see some of that on the testing end of things, as for preclinical, before preclinical trials. Some of that is starting to happen. There's another really great website. It's in the UK. It's called NC3Rs. And if your listeners want to go look at that, you'll see a lot about some of the developing technologies, and some of this replacement is already happening. I mean, the bottom line is as soon as something is identified that will be reliable and viable and give predictive answers that doesn't include an animal and is validated, by the regulatory agencies as safe for humans to use, it goes on the market and the animals come out of the equation. And so there have been some already, and my hope is that we continue to move in that direction. I mean, this really is the answer, and this is what the animal rights people don't get. They want to remove animals from research now, and there is no alternative. There's nothing to put in its place, right? I mean, we're all doing this because the public demands treatments and cures for their loved ones, including their pets, and they're being lied to and told that they can have all of that without animals, and that is a complete fabrication. It's completely untrue, and it's terribly irresponsible of our lawmakers and the media to continue to propagate this sort of thinking and philosophy, because it's not based on facts. And people and animals are going to pay a very dear price if these folks who are in these influential positions don't start doing some homework and collecting some information.
All right. Well, that's part of the purpose of this interview. And you talked about the benefit for pets, and that's one thing I really wanted to have you talk about was One thing that many of these animal lovers may not be aware of in the general public is that animal testing benefits the animals themselves. Can you talk about some of these benefits, Dr. Buckmaster?
Sure. I mean, the most obvious thing is veterinary medicine is informed by research with animals. Right?
Yeah.
So there's that. Then you get into things like flea meds, right? Flea medications, tick medications, nutrition, right? Making sure that your animals have appropriate nutrition. And then there's more sort of disease kinds of things. And you mentioned dogs earlier, and dogs are actually very powerful models for the study of human disease, but also dog disease. The truth of the matter is that dogs and people get many of the same diseases, and they get them naturally, right? So unlike with mice where we have to kind of create cancer in mice don't naturally get cancer, but we're not studying that level of impact of cancer when we look at mice. We're not studying how to cure them necessarily. We're trying to understand the molecular underpinnings or the genetic or cellular underpinnings of cancer in that case. But when you talk about dogs, and there's a lot of this now where you have vet clinics, veterinarians collaborating with biomedical researchers, this One Health initiative, because dogs and humans get a lot of the same diseases. They get them naturally. And maybe it's not such a big surprise because we have sort of grown up together over the years, exposed to the same environments and evolving in the same, earth, and but we get a lot of the same diseases. And some really obvious examples. I gave you a hyperlink to one. This is really an interesting one: myotubular myopathy, and that hyperlink for the folks who are listening is entitled "Another Brick in the Wall," I think it's "Another Brick in the Wall," and it was made by produced by Transnetics. But this is an amazing story. This is a terrible muscular disorder that impacts boys. It's genetically transmitted, and they are very fragile, and they die very young. Well, it turns out that dogs carry the same gene and suffer from this very same disease. And you'll see in the video that they found a dog who carried this gene, and that dog then made its way to the research folks, and they were able to then characterize the gene. And I will tell you this, the first clinical trial for treating this disease with gene therapy has begun, and we should get results soon. The same is true for muscular dystrophy. We're hearing a lot from some of the extreme activists right now about dogs and muscular dystrophy, and they shouldn't be part of this work. Well, dogs get muscular dystrophy. The reason they're a model for study for Duchenne muscular dystrophy is it's a disease that affects them as well. And I can tell you that story parallels the myotubular myopathy story, because a clinical trial for gene therapy to treat and cure Duchenne muscular dystrophy has also just been approved, right? There's another disease called, what's it called? Canine multiple system degeneration. So this is a disease that affects dogs. And what happens in this disease is that multiple areas of the brain degenerate, and these are parts of the brain that control movement. And so these poor dogs get very uncoordinated about 6 months of age, and they get completely incapacitated by about the age of 2. And so some biomedical researchers have been working with these animals, and they have identified the gene responsible for this. And these dogs can be screened for this now, so that they don't end up being sold to folks. And we can screen for that like we would screen for other things like Tay-Sachs disorder in people or something else like that. But the really, really cool part of that story is that it was also identified by some biomedical researchers who were studying a very similar disease in children, this devastating neurological disorder that impairs their movement because of this very diffuse damage to the brain. Well, a bunch of people who were studying children found the same gene. It turns out that it's the same gene, right? That the same gene that impacts dogs and causes this disease also causes this disease in children. And so those groups collaborated and determined through basic research exactly what this gene was doing and why it was causing this problem. And it turns out that the gene impairs the brain's ability to use oxygen and nutrients, and so they are devising now treatment strategies to overcome this hurdle and these roadblocks and allow children to live normal lives, right? So this is what the public doesn't understand, and they don't get all of this information from the extremists because they don't want them to know this truth. And this is also why Matt wrote that story. It's an absolute fact. And there's a really big field now called One Health. A lot of these collaborations are happening. Dogs get a lot of the same cancers that humans get. In fact, some tumor tissue for some cancers, if you put them under a microscope and you have dog on one side and human on another side, they're indistinguishable. I mean, so this is how similar these diseases are. And so working with patients, dog patients, and using what's been learned from basic research over the past several decades to develop therapies now to treat these dogs will also expedite treatments in people, right? Because basically then we can move right into the clinical trial for people. Or in some cases, some of these drugs that are being used to help and treat these dogs now currently are already on the market. So then that use can be ascribed then to maybe treating the disease in people as well. So this is really powerful.
It is.
It's dogs and people, and it's really loving, and shutting that off before we have an alternative way to do that is really not loving.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned the muscular dystrophy thing, and Matt writes in his article that PETA just launched a public pressure campaign against Texas A&M.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what I was talking about. I would tell you, I have met those dogs personally. And I also, through the National Animal Interest Alliance, we have a program called Homes for Animal Heroes, which I co-founded, and we place dogs for adoption afterward. And so we have placed, in order to study Duchenne muscular dystrophy in dogs, you have to have a female carrier, and she makes puppies, and some of them are affected, and you can study the disease, and some of them are not. And this disease is studied by various institutions across the country. And I can tell you, though, that we have placed several of these unaffected animals in loving homes, which is also another thing that the research community has been doing for over 40 years with all kinds of animals. So Homes for Animal Heroes is a program that is specifically dedicated to placing dogs for post-study. And then what we do is we have a Facebook page, and hopefully you'll post that link as well.
Sure
People
will.
can go there and find out the real truth, see these heroes for who they really are, and find out what they've contributed. The story I just told you about the disorder that affects the brain is in there, in fact. So they did that, and I could just tell you that I've been to Texas A&M, and I've met these dogs and seen this colony personally, and none of what they're saying. They have a tendency to take something and blow it completely out of context and distort the facts. And they can do this with video as well, and they tell a different story. But I was just there. I mean, these dogs they're in. The people love these animals. They have outside time. They have swimming pools. They have special, it's really cute. Actually, if you go to Come See Our World, you'll see some dogs, and we can't say from where, but as I said, people from all over the country have sent us images, right? And so there's some dogs you'll see in various institutions that have swimming pools, right? It's not true that they don't all have outside time. Those who are in locations where that's possible do, and where it's hot, they have swimming pools. But in this case, with these particular dogs, they also have swimming pools, and they also have, you see things posted. There's special requirements about how much time they can spend in the heat, right? Because one of the things that happens with these dogs in their disease is that their tongues get really thick and they can't pant as well, right? And that's why they get, at a certain point, they'll get like more of a mushy, gruely kind of food, which they make a mess with, which looks like in this video horrible drooling. If you look carefully at that dog, his tail is also wagging, right? The dogs with muscular dystrophy don't get as severe a disease as the young boys with muscular dystrophy get, and the dogs are monitored very carefully, and their comfort is assured the entire time. And when their disease gets really aggressive, and I don't think it has to get to this point, I think the dogs aren't even, I don't think they have to progress as far as they used to in the past, because they've learned so much, and now they have a gene therapy they're going to use. But when the disease becomes aggressive in dogs, they're euthanized with the people who love them all around them. We don't have that luxury for our young boys. Those young boys just continue to suffer until eventually they stop breathing, and they're surrounded by parents who are devastated in the hospital. It is not the same.
Yeah, and that really leads me into the next question is, a key consideration, of course, is ethics. You just cannot use humans as test subjects.
Nor would they be a good model.
Oh, okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So let's go back to the mouse example, right?
I got about 4 minutes left, Dr.
Got it. We'll go back to the mouse example really fast, right? So what we do with mice is we'll breed 21 generations. We'll breed them out 21 generations. And so basically what you have is a population of identical animals. And this is important because if you're going to study disease, you have to know everything there is to know about the model you're using, right? And you want them to be as similar as possible so that you can distinguish cause and effect. So if you get some kind of result, you want to be able to You want to be able to say that it's not from something you didn't expect. So we know everything about. We know their genetic we know their genetic makeup. We know their health histories. We know everything about these animals. It's very, very standardized. You won't get that with people. For one thing, we're all really different, and for another, people can lie about their health history. So there's a lot of variability in there. So it's really hard to create a cause and effect situation with that level of variability. And the only way to wash out variability is to use more and more people. And I mean, honestly, at some point we would run out of people before we could ever answer a question in a statistically valid way.
Oh, interesting. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, I think about all these things when I'm hanging out here late at night.
Okay, got about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Let me ask you just a generic, open-ended question.
Mm-hmm.
Do animals have rights?
Right. So...
How would you answer that?
Well, the answer is no, because rights are a human construct tied to a constitution, right? Mm-hmm. Animals don't vote, and they don't buy homes, and they don't do all of these other things, right? Rights are something that is ascribed to sort of your way to legally navigate society, and so they don't have rights. And that does not mean at all that they don't absolutely deserve compassionate care and respect from their caregivers, and the people responsible for that are human beings, right? And so sometimes people will say, well, you don't believe in animal rights, that must mean you don't love animals. There's nothing, it couldn't be farther from the truth. I am an animal welfarist through and through, and I will tell you something about the animal rights movement. Animal rights, in every single case, ends up hurting animals. Because if you start with the initial premise of whatever the animal rights movement is presenting, let's say here's an example: don't hunt deer because it's cruel. Okay, well that's because they don't understand population management. What will happen if the population if the overpopulation of deer is not culled, then they will starve to death. And that is the most painful way for an animal to die, and that's very cruel, right? So this is what I mean. They start off with these things that these very shallow intentions, and really it's all a fundraising gimmick to begin with. And if you carry it out to the end, and you think about what will happen to the animal if you just keep thinking about what happens as a result of this decision, I guarantee you, if you do that, it's a little mental exercise you can do for yourself. The next time you hear an animal rights proposal is to go to the end of what will happen in the chain of events in your thoughts, and the animal will be harmed. Animal rights hurts animals in every single case.
Okay, I got about a minute left, Dr. Buckmaster. Any final thoughts on this topic before we close?
Well, the distinction between animal welfare and animal rights, I think, is really critical. The truth of the matter is that our bond with animals, the human-animal bond, is being attacked from multiple angles by animal rights zealots who don't believe that animals should be a part of our life. In fact, PETA doesn't even believe they should be pets, and neither does HSUS. HSUS doesn't believe in pets. PETA doesn't believe in pets. They consider it an enslavement of animals. This bond between us is really critical, and honestly, I don't think humans and animals can live without each other for a variety of reasons. And it's part of the fabric of our humanity. And we will never be able to get through this sort of smokescreen that they've put up until we can appreciate the distinction between animal welfare, which is ensuring that our animals have all of their needs met, and that we have compassion and respect for them, and we treat them the way we should because we love them. And animal rights, which is an agenda that's based on profit-making and control and ends up hurting animals. This would be what I would leave people with. The next time you hear somebody talk about animal rights, think about whether or not they're really talking about something that's an animal welfare position or a personal agenda position, because all animal rights positions are based on personal agendas, and they all hurt animals, and many of them hurt people as well.
Very good. Dr. Cindy Buckmaster, thank you, ma'am, for your expertise and your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Robert. I appreciate it, too. Have a great evening.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.